Welcome, dear listener, to one of the most quietly powerful books ever written about the human mind and the force that drives every great life ever lived. The book you are about to hear is called The Will. It's Nature, Power, and Development. It was written by William Walker Atkinson, a remarkable American author, lawyer, merchant, and pioneer of what he himself called a new psychology. Born in 1862, Atkinson lived through an era of enormous change, an era when the human mind was just beginning to be studied with the same seriousness once reserved only for the physical world. And yet, even among the most forward-thinking thinkers of his time, Atkinson stood apart. He wrote with a warmth and directness that made the deepest ideas feel personal, felt, and immediately useful. He did not write for scholars behind closed doors. He wrote for you, the person who wakes up each morning with dreams and desires, who sometimes acts with fierce determination and sometimes cannot seem to act at all, who wonders why some people seem to bend the world to their intentions while others drift along the current of circumstance. The answer, Atkinson believed, lay in understanding will, not as some vague, mystical quality that a lucky few are born with, but as a living, learnable, developable power that each of us carries within us right now. In this book, he breaks it down into its natural phases, examines how desire, decision, and action all work together, and then shows us, in plain, honest language, how we can strengthen and direct this power in our own lives. What you are about to hear is part one of this three-part work. It covers the nature will in its most fundamental forms, what it is, where it comes from, how desire feeds it, how decisive will shapes it, how action will releases it, and what lies beneath it all in what Atkinson called the ultimate will. Parts 2 and 3 are waiting for you on our channel, where the journey goes deeper into the practical development and exercise of this extraordinary inner power. But for now, settle in, take a breath, and let us begin. Chapter 1. What is will? There's a word we use every single day, a word so familiar we rarely stop to question what it truly means. And yet understanding it, really understanding it, maybe the single most transforming thing a person can ever do. That word is will. When we say a person has willpower, we mean something. We mean they possess a quality that others lack. We mean they can hold a course when others waver, press forward when others retreat, and restrain themselves when others surrender. But what exactly is this thing we call will? Is it force? Is it a faculty? Is it something born into us or something built? William Walker Atkinson devoted serious thought and serious pages to answering this question, and what he arrived at is both elegant and deeply practical. Will, he tells us, is not a single thing. It is not one simple power that either exists in a person or does not. Will is better understood as a living process, a flowing movement from the inside a human being outward into the world, and it moves through three great phases. The first phase is what he calls desire will. This is the stage of wanting, of feeling, of that deep internal pull towards something or away from something. This is where will is born, in the quiet heat of a longing, in the stirring of a need, in the recognition of an object that the self reaches toward. The second phase is what he calls decisive will. This is a stage of choosing, of weighing and deliberating, of holding two possibilities in the mind at the same time, and through the use of reason and attention, determining which one shall win. This is a great middle stage, the stage where impulses either restrained or permitted, where wisdom either enters the picture or is left outside. And the third phase is what he calls action will. This is a stage of doing, of releasing the stored energy of intention and letting it flow outward into movement, into speech, into effort, into the world. This is the phase where it becomes real to everyone around us, and more importantly, real to us. Now, these three phases are always present in every act of will, even when they seem to happen so quickly that we cannot see the separate parts. Think of the last time you made a truly deliberate choice. Not a reflex, not a habit, but a genuine, conscious act of will. Perhaps you decided to rise early despite every comfortable impulse urging you to stay beneath the covers. Perhaps you chose to hold your tongue when every feeling inside you wanted to speak sharply. Perhaps you set out toward a goal when the easier road would have been to simply stand still. In each of those moments, all three phases were at work. You felt something, a desire, a value, a pull toward the better version of yourself. That was desire will speaking. Then you weighed the competing voices within you. The comfort of sleep against the satisfaction of discipline. The pleasure of an angry word against the dignity of silence. That was decisive will doing its quiet, powerful work. And then something let go inside you. Something released. And you acted. That was action will, the final, ultimate expression of the inner self in outward motion. Atkinson is careful to point out that this is not merely an abstract theory. It is a map of the territory inside every human being who has ever tried to do anything at all. And maps, as every traveler knows, are only useful if you study them carefully enough to actually follow them. So let us study this one. There is something else Atkinson wants us to understand from the very beginning, something he returns to again and again throughout this book, and it is this. Will is not separate from us. It is not a tool we pick up and put down. It is woven into the very fabric of the self, of the ego, as he calls it, so closely that at the deepest level, the speakable is almost a speak of the person themselves. This is why the development of will is not merely a self-improvement project. It is not like learning to play the piano or acquiring a new language, though it shares something with both of those. The development of will is, in the truest sense, the development of the self, and that, dear listener, is what this book is really about. Chapter 2, Desire Will. Every act of will begins with a feeling before we decide anything, before we do anything, before we reach for anything in the world outside us or resist anything pressing upon us. There's first a feeling, a pull, a sense of movement within the self towards something or away from something. This feeling is desire, and desire, as Atkinson makes beautifully clear, is not a weakness. It is not something to be ashamed of or suppress merely for the sake of suppression. Desire is the very fuel of will. Without it, will has nothing to work with, no direction to move in, no energy to release. Desire is the fire, and action is the steam. Now, the word desire is a large one, and Atkinson takes care to show us just how large. We often think of desire as simply wanting something strongly, but there are many shades and colors to the wanting experience. There is longing, that impatient, continued reaching towards something we do not yet have. There is hankering, that particular hunger for what we once possessed and have since lost, or for what lies just beyond our present reach. There is coveting, that intense focus upon something that belongs to another or that lies within another's power to give or withhold. There is wishing, that gentler, more diffuse form of wanting, directed at things more remote, less clearly seen, less urgently felt. All of these, Atkinson tells us, are variations on a single central experience, the experience of want to. Every shade, every flavor, every degree of desire is, at its root, a form of want to, and this want of feeling is the beginning of all will. Now, here is where things become genuinely interesting and genuinely important for anyone who wishes to understand themselves. Desire has two stages within itself. The first stage is the feeling stage. This is the pure experience of wanting, the warmth or the ache or the pull that arises when we encounter something that excites or troubles us. Many desires never move beyond this stage. They simmer in us, vague and unresolved, neither strong enough to demand action nor clear enough to be properly examined. They are, as Atkinson puts it, more or less vague feelings or attractions, present real, but not yet powerful enough to call the will into response. The second stage is when that feeling blazes up, when it grows so strong, so insistent, so urgent that it does something more than merely feel. It calls upon the will to respond. It demands action. It reaches into the deeper levels of the mind and sends out a call that cannot be ignored. This is the moment when desire will become a genuine force, not just a feeling, but a direction, a demand, a claim upon the energy of the self. Now, you might ask, is every desire worth following? Is every want worth releasing into action? Of course not. And this is precisely where the importance of understanding desire becomes so clear, because desire is precedent to every act of will. It comes first, it comes always, and it comes whether we are paying attention to it or not. If we allow our desires to be formed randomly, shaped by whatever happens to cross our path, tug in every direction by every passing attraction or discomfort, then our will follow suit, scattered, impulsive, inconsistent, weak. But if we learn to consciously shape and direct our desires, to encourage the ones that point toward our highest good and gently restrain the ones that lead us downward, then we are, in a very real sense, taking hold of the will at its very source. Atkinson puts it powerfully and plainly. If desire is a great insider of the will, then if we control, rouse, or restrain desire, we have in our hands the mastery of will. Read that again in your mind for a moment. If we control desire, we have the mastery of will. This is not a small claim. This is a revolutionary one. It means that the path to a strong will does not begin with forcing yourself to do difficult things. It begins with carefully tending the fire of what you want, cultivating the desires that serve you and not feeding the desires that do not. How do we do this? Atkinson gives us a clear method. To encourage a desire, we direct our attention toward the ideal that desire represents. We use our imagination to picture it fully and vividly. We dwell upon it. We hold it before us in the mind's eye with concentration and interest until the feeling stage of desire blazes upward into that second, active, calling stage. We essentially fan the spark into a flame, and to restrain or discourage a desire that does not serve us, we do the opposite. We direct our attention away from the object of that desire and towards something diametrically opposed to it. We do not fight the desire directly. Fighting it directly only gives it more power, more attention, more of our energy. Instead, we concentrate on the opposite ideal. We pour our imagination and attention into what we actually want our life to become. And the undesirable desire, starved of the attention it needs, quietly fades. This is what Atkinson calls the rule of the new psychology. Concentrate on the opposite. There is something else about desire that Atkinson wants us to understand. Something that reaches beneath the surface of our ordinary conscious experience. Because not all of our desires arise in the visible daylight of conscious awareness. He speaks of subconscious desires, the vast, quiet reservoir of wants and inclinations that lie beneath the surface of our everyday thinking, shaped by our heredity, our past experiences, the suggestions we have absorbed from others, and the accumulated wisdom or wounds of everything we have ever lived through. These subconscious desires do not simply disappear because we are not aware of them. They wait. They lie latent in that great storehouse of the inner mind, and they stir into life whenever some object or circumstance in the outer world touches the spring that releases them. We have all had the experience of suddenly feeling a powerful wanting or a deep aversion to something with no clear reason why. And this is often why. Something in the present moment awakened a sleeping desire or a buried fear from the subconscious depths. And then there are what Atkinson calls superconscious desires, those higher promptings that occasionally drop down into our awareness from what he describes as the elevated regions of the mind. These are the intuitional nudges, the quiet insistences, the feelings that seem to come from somewhere deeper and wiser than our ordinary thinking self. These desires, he says, always lead upward, never downward. When we feel a strong pull towards something higher, nobler, more expansive than our current circumstances, a pull that cannot be explained by ordinary logic, this, he suggests, is the superconscious speaking, and the test by which we may always recognize these higher promptings is this. They lead up, always up, never down. Let this be the touchstone, he says. Apply it always to these intuitional urgings. Now, we must not leave this chapter without hearing Atkinson's great practical call. He does not merely explain desire. He urges us to use it, to build it, to fan it into fierce life in the direction of our highest aims. He says, and these words are worth holding close. If you desire to increase and develop the will along any particular lines, the first thing you should do is build up your desire for the attainment of that thing. Use every possible effort to cultivate the appropriate desire, to fan into a fierce blaze the spark you find within yourself. Dwell upon it. Encourage it in every way. You must want to, and want to earnestly, actively, vigorously, constantly, persistently, want in a degree that will demand a response of will, and which will brook no refusal. Such desire, he tells us beautifully, is the heat which produces the steam of the action will. Turn on your drafts and keep the fires of desire fiercely burning. If you wish to keep on a full head of steam, what a magnificent image that is. The locomotive of the will, powered not by force or discipline alone, but by the living, burning heat of genuine desire. Let us carry that image forward as we move into the next great phase. Chapter 3, Decisive Will. We have seen how desire sets everything in motion. We have felt the fire of that first great phase of will. The wanting, the feeling, the call that rises from within toward some object or ideal. But desire alone is not enough. The person who acts on every desire the moment it arises, who allows every impulse to pass immediately into action without pause, without reflection, without any exercise of judgment, is not a person of strong will. That person is a person of impulse. And impulse, while it has its place and its uses, is not the same thing as will. Between desire, will, and action, there lies a third, vitally important stage. The stage that separates the merely reactive person from the truly self-directed one. Atkinson calls this decisive will. Decisive will is the power of choice. It is the capacity to hold two or more competing desires, motives, or possible courses of action in the mind at the same time, to weigh them, compare them, test them against reason and judgment, and then to reach a firm, deliberate decision about which path shall be taken. This is a faculty that the older definitions of will are actually pointing to when they speak of will as the power of the mind that enables a person to choose between two courses of action, or the faculty by which one decides, or the settlement by the mind of a psychic issue. All of these definitions are capturing this second, middle phase, the decisive, deliberating, choosing phase. Now, decisive will can exist in two forms. The first is what Atkinson calls latent will, the underlying power to choose, which may be present in a person but not yet awakened or trained into reliable use. The second is active will, the actual, living exercise of that choosing capacity in the face of real competing desires and real consequences. And here is something essential to understand. Without decisive will, desire passes directly into action. There is no pause. There is no consideration. The strongest desire of the moment simply wins, the way a louder voice wins a room where everyone is shouting at once. The psychological law is that the degree of desire depends upon the amount of pleasure or pain connected with an idea, and without the intervention of decisive will, the nearest, most vivid, most immediately pressing desire always carries the day. This is why, Atkinson observes, we so often seem to sacrifice our long-term well-being for the immediate comfort of the present moment. It is not because we are foolish or weak in any permanent sense. It is because of the natural distortion of what we might call the perspective of desire. Objects and satisfactions that are nearer in time and space seem larger and more pressing than those that are more remote. Just as a penny held close to the eye will appear larger than a full moon shining in the sky. $1 today seems more attractive than $2 a year from now. The pleasure of this moment seems more real than the consequences that will arrive later. This is the great enemy that decisive will is designed to defeat. By intervening between desire will and action will, it widens the lens. It brings into view not just what is near and immediate, but what is distant and consequential. It allows us to ask, what will this choice mean not just now, but later? Not just for this desire, but for the whole shape of the life I am building? Atkinson gives us two wonderfully vivid illustrations to make this real. The first is the character of Jeppe, drawn from the work of the philosopher Hofting. Jeppe feels a strong desire to spend his money on a drink of spirits, but his wife has instructed him to buy soap, and he knows that if he spends the money on drink, she will punish him for it. And so arises a deliberation. His stomach wants the liquor. His back fears a beating. My stomach says you shall, says Jeppe. My back says you shall not. For a time, these two desires struggle in the field of consciousness. But eventually Jeppe makes his choice. He fixes his attention upon his stomach, drives his back out of the field of consciousness, and follows a desire that seems larger and more pressing in that moment. The point is not that Jeppe made the right choice. The point is that he did make a choice. Imperfectly, yes. With limited wisdom, yes. But a choice nonetheless. He exercised, however clumsily, some form of decisive will. The second illustration is the old philosophical puzzle of the donkey, who suddenly finds himself standing exactly equidistant between two equally large, equally attractive stacks of hay. Both are identical in their appeal. Both call to him with equal force. And because no desire is stronger than the other, because there is no factor to tip the scales one way or the other, the poor donkey cannot choose. He stands paralyzed between the two possibilities and, unable to decide, starves to death. This Atkinson gently points out, is what becomes of us when decisive will is entirely absent. Not the dramatic death of the donkey, perhaps, but a kind of slow paralysis. We find ourselves unable to commit, unable to move, forever weighing and deliberating, but never arriving at a decision. And in that state, we drift. Not because we lack desire, but because we lack the decisive capacity to act upon one desire while setting the other aside. The person of strong, decisive will, faced with the same impossible choice as the donkey, would simply say, each seems attractive. Both are equally available. I must choose one and forget the other. And then, fixing the attention upon one arbitrarily selected possibility, would move toward it with full commitment. This is the secret at the heart of decisive will. It does not always require that we find a perfect, objectively correct answer before we act. Sometimes it simply requires that we decide, that we commit, that we trust our judgment enough to move forward rather than standing frozen between possibilities until the opportunity has passed us by. Now, Atkinson raises a fascinating question at this point. Is decisive will really just intellectual deliberation? Is it not simply the intellect doing its work of weighing and comparing? Why should we call it a phase of will at all? This is a beautiful question, and his answer is equally beautiful. Yes, the intellect plays an important part in deliberation. Yes, the decisive will calls upon reason to assist it, uses memory to bring forward a record of past experience, employs imagination to picture the possible future consequences of present choices. All of this is true, but the final act, the act of actually deciding, is not itself an intellectual act. It is an act of will. Many people, he observes, have fine intellects and sharp powers of discrimination. They can see clearly. They can weigh and compare with great precision. And yet they cannot make up their minds. They prefer to delegate the final decision to someone else, or simply to let circumstances decide for them. The making up of the mind, that final, firm step, is distinctively an act of the will, not of the intellect, and the instrument by which decisive will accomplishes this final step is attention. Attention is the great tool of the decisive will. It is by fixing the attention firmly upon that which judgment has identified as the best available option, and then holding it there, while actively dismissing the competing voices and desires that press for recognition, that a decision is actually made and actually held. This combination of voluntary attention, the deliberate focusing of the mind upon a chosen object, and what Atkinson calls voluntary inhibition, the deliberate refusal to allow the mind to wander toward competing distractions and desires, is what produces that quality of mind we recognize in every successful person. Concentration. Concentration is a focusing of all the mental energies, under the will, upon a fixed object or purpose. Genius, Atkinson says, is made up largely of concentration, not raw intelligence, not natural talent alone, but the sustained, willed capacity to hold the mind steady upon its chosen aim, even when 1,000 other things are pressing for attention. The decisive will, then, is the great middle manager of the self. It stands between the hot energy of desire and the releasing power of action. It takes what could be mere impulse and shapes it into intention. It takes what could be mere reaction and transforms it into response. And we must be clear about one last thing here. The goal is not to abolish impulse entirely. Atkinson is too wise and too honest for that extreme. There are people whose impulses are well ordered, whose instincts are generally sound, whose hair trigger responsiveness is actually an asset, particularly in situations that demand rapid action and immediate decision. These people do not always benefit from more deliberation. Too much inhibition can be as damaging as too little. The wise course is always the middle one. Deliberate carefully when the situation permits and the stakes are high, and then, having deliberated, use the will to decide firmly, neither to rush past decision nor to stall forever short of it, to think and then to choose and then to act. That is the discipline of the decisive will. Chapter 4, Action Will. We have traveled now through the first two great phases of will, the fire of desire will and the shaping intelligence of decisive will. We have seen how desire is the fuel that powers the whole great engine of the self, and how the decisive capacity sits as a wise judge between the urgency of wanting and the release of action. Now we arrive at the third phase, the one that all of this has been building toward, the one that makes all the difference between the person who dreams and the one who does, the phase that Atkinson calls action will. Action will is a dynamic phase. It is the release. It is the moment when everything that has been prepared in the interior world, the desire, the deliberation, the decision, finally breaks into the exterior world as actual, visible, tangible doing. Atkinson is direct about this. Authorities tell us that what concerns itself with action, first, last, and all the time. In action lies the willness of will. We may desire to have or to do something very much. We may even decide to have or do it and perform the acts leading toward it. But unless that desire and that decision spring into action, unless the spring of the action will is actually released, the full manifestation of will has not yet occurred. This is important and humbling, because it means that desire alone is not will. Decision alone is not will. The mental attitude of the person of will is not simply, I want, or I have decided. It is the much more vigorous and final declaration, I do. Not that he desires to do. Not merely that he has decided to do, but that he actually, presently, actively does. Now, action will manifest in several recognizable forms, and Atkinson walks us through each of them with care. The first and most obvious is action in physical movement. You feel the desire to move across a room. You deliberate, however briefly, about whether to do so. You decide, and then something releases. Something lets go inside you, and you move. Your arm rises. Your body carries you forward. The spring is released, and the action follows. This is action will in its most visible, undeniable form. The second form is action in the direction of thought. This is subtler, but equally real and perhaps more important for the long-term development of the self. You set into deliberate operation the mental activities of reasoning, comparing, judging, or you direct and hold the stream of thought to its proper channel, preventing it from wandering into the directions it naturally tends toward without guidance. You also, by an act of action will, inhibit thoughts along certain lines, keeping the mental gaze away from subjects you decided are not worth dwelling on, and refuse and entertain tendencies in those directions. The third form is action in the exercise of attention. You turn the attention deliberately, willfully, upon any object, either in the outer world or within the mind, and you hold it there. This, Atkinson says, is one of the most important manifestations of action will. In its highest and most disciplined form, it becomes concentration. And concentration, possessed in high degree, is a defining quality of every successful person who has ever lived. The fourth form is action in the exercise of memory, the deliberate calling up of stored impressions, experiences, and associations. When we actively seek to remember, to draw upon what we know, to place past learning in the service of present action, we are exercising a genuine form of action will. The fifth form is action upon the subconscious mental faculties, that whole rich, largely unexplored realm beneath the surface of ordinary consciousness, where so much of our actual processing and creating takes place. Atkinson notes that this class of activity is scarcely recognized by the orthodox psychologists of his time, but considers it one of the most important fields of practical development that the new psychology has opened up. And he is right. The ability to consciously direct one's intentions into subconscious, to, as it were, plant seeds in that deeper soil and trust that they will grow according to the guidance one has given them. This is a power that the person trained can genuinely develop. The sixth and final form he names as action in the direction of exciting or repressing desire, the emotions and the feelings. The untrained nature, he observes, simply allows desires, feelings, and emotions to arise and fall on their own schedule, driven by whatever happens to be happening in the outer world. But the person who cultivated will actively employ his action will to arouse the feelings that serve them, to kindle enthusiasm, to stoke determination, to rouse the productive fires of desire, and equally to calm and restrain the feelings that do not serve, to quiet impulse, to cool anger, to soften unnecessary agitation. This is a radical idea and a genuinely empowering one. Our emotional life is not simply something that happens to us. It is something we can, with practice and with will, genuinely direct. But we must pause here and consider one of the most important concepts in this entire phase of action will, the concept of inhibition. Inhibition is the capacity of the will to restrain action. It is, as Atkinson beautifully puts it, the brakes of the will. And just as every vehicle needs brakes just as much as it needs an engine, the full power of action will cannot be properly used without a well-developed capacity for inhibition. This may seem counterintuitive. We tend to think of a strong will as something that acts, that presses forward, that insists and persists. And all of that is true, but a will that cannot also restrain itself, that cannot hold back when restraint is wisdom, that cannot say no to the immediate in favor of the eventual, that cannot absorb provocation without immediately reacting. That will is not truly strong. It is merely urgent. Atkinson draws upon the psychologist James here, who reminds us that as mental evolution goes on and the complexity of human consciousness grows, the multiplication of the inhibitions to which every impulse is exposed also grows. The capacity for inhibition is itself a sign of development in young children, in animals, in early stages of personal development. Every desire tends to produce its corresponding action almost immediately. There is very little space between the wanting and the doing. But as a person grows in experience and wisdom, a new layer of response develops. The capacity to pause, to consider, to restrain, to choose something better. The psychologist Halleck, whom Atkinson also draws upon, makes the point with memorable clarity. If the tail of a cat is pinched, the customary action will follow without hesitation. But if the feelings of a cultivated person are hurt, there will often be no outward sign. The cat cannot inhibit. The cultivated person can. The effort of a developed will is nowhere more marked than in inhibition, and this is what we recognize as self-control. Self-control is not suppression. It is not the denial of desire. It is the intelligent mastery of desire, the capacity to hold back from the lesser satisfaction in favor of the greater one, to endure the smaller discomfort rather than run from it into the arms of a larger one later. The strong-willed person restrains the impulse toward immediate pleasure when that pleasure carries a price too high to be worth paying. They suffer the lesser pain in order to escape the greater. They are willing to wait for what is worth waiting for. The person of action will in its fullest development is therefore someone who possesses both qualities: the capacity for decisive, energetic, committed action, and the capacity for wise, deliberate, well-timed restraint. Action when action is called for. Inhibition when inhibition is wisdom. And the discernment to know the difference. This is the full power of action will. Chapter 5. The Ultimate Will. We have now traveled through the three great phases of will: the wanting of desire will, the choosing of decisive will, and the doing of action will. We have seen how they flow into one another, how each is necessary to the others, and how together they form the great moving force of the human life, lived deliberately and with purpose. But Atkinson is not finished, because beneath all three of these phases, beneath the desiring and the deciding and the doing, there lies something else, something that cannot be fully explained by any of them, something that all of them depend upon, but none of them fully account for. He calls it the ultimate will. Now, Atkinson is a man of practical intent. He is not here to lead us into the deep waters of metaphysics, if he can avoid it. He says so honestly. But here, at this final chapter of the first part of this book, he cannot resist pausing to show us something that he considers essential to a real understanding of what will is and where it sits within the human being. He begins by noting that there is a school of philosophy known as the school of voluntarism, which makes a claim that differs significantly from the more orthodox philosophical schools. Most philosophical traditions, he observes, hold that reason or intelligence is a fundamental, basic principle of mind and life, that what we call is subordinate to reason, a secondary expression of the deeper rational nature of the ego. But the voluntarists hold something quite different. They hold that being itself, in its most inmost nature, is will, that reason and intellect are not the masters, but the servants. Faculties have been evolved by will in order to serve it, to enable it to manifest and act more effectively in the world. That the ego itself is volitional at its core, and rational only in a secondary sense. And the evidence they offer is this: will precedes intellect in the scale of life. Go down the ladder of living creatures, and you'll find that intellect and reason weaken and fade as you descend. But will, the basic force of striving, wanting, pressing outward into the world, that does not fade. It is present in full force from the very beginning of life, in the simplest creatures, in infants, in every living thing that orients itself towards something or away from something. Will is always there. This, the voluntarists say, proves that will is a fundamental reality, and intellect merely its instrument. Atkinson does not ask us to take sides in this philosophical debate. He simply wants us to know that it exists, and that it points towards something real about the nature of will, because here is what his own experience and observation have confirmed. Will occupies a place very near indeed to the throne of being within the ego. It is more fundamental than our feelings, more fundamental than our thoughts, more fundamental even than our decisions, and he invites us to prove this to ourselves through a simple exercise of self-analysis. Begin with desire will. Can you separate the I from the feeling of desire? Can you observe yourself feeling and recognize that the feeling is happening to you, that you, the observer, are distinct from the feeling itself? Yes, you can. You can say, I feel, I desire, I want. And in saying so, You've already made a distinction between the experience and the experiencer. The desire is something happening to you. You can restrain it or arouse it by deliberate use of will. So the feeling and the self can be distinguished. Now move to decisive will. Can you separate the I from the thoughts and reasoning of the deliberating mind? Can you observe yourself thinking and recognize that the thought is not the thinker, that you are using the intellect rather than being the intellect? Yes, again, you can direct your attention this way and that. You can summon memories and images. You can turn reason toward this question or that one. So here too, the self and its intellectual processes can, with care, be distinguished, but now move to action will. And here something changes. Try to exercise the action will and stand apart from it at the same time. Try to act and observe yourself acting from a position of complete separateness. You will find that you cannot. The moment you act, truly, fully act, you are entirely there in the act. The I is not watching from a safe distance. The I is the act itself. You cannot will to do something without the entire self being involved in the willing and the doing. This is what Atkinson means when he says that will in its final phase is something very close to the ego, closer than desire, closer than reason. In the final act of willing, there is no separation possible between the actor and the act. And here we arrive at the most honest and remarkable admission in the entire book. Atkinson, after all his careful analysis, all his systematic exploration of the phases and forms and workings of will, here he stops. He says, there is sometimes a moment when we are aware of not being willing to release the spring of action will, not willing to let go of that part of ourselves. And this happens in spite of the strongest want to of desire, in spite of the clearest ought to of reason. Why don't we let go and do in these cases? And he gives the only honest answer that can be given, because we do not will to, and that answer, he tells us, is something above definitions and above analysis. It is like a woman's, because final, complete in itself, requiring nothing further to justify it. This is the ultimate will, the thing that lets go or will not let go, the thing that all desire, all reason, all deliberation can press upon and influence, but cannot compel, the thing that is so close to the core of the self that, in the end, it simply is the self. Psychology can describe what will does. It can map the phases through which it moves. It can chart the conditions that strengthen or weaken it. But what will ultimately is, this it cannot tell us, because what will ultimately is bound up with what the ego ultimately is. And the ego in its final nature is beyond the reach of any science, any analysis, any system of thought. The new psychology, Atkinson says, is much concerned with this ultimate will, this thing that lets go or will not let go. Without attempting to fully explain it, it endeavors to lead us to use it, to employ it, to trust it. And it teaches us that this ultimate will can be trained to act along subconscious lines, that it can be directed inward as well as outward, that it can do great work for us in that immense inner field we are only beginning to explore. There are those who dismiss this idea, who say that the subconscious cannot be directed by will. But Atkinson is unfazed. It is a fact, he says, as the experience of individuals proves satisfactorily to themselves. And so we arrive at the end of this first great section of the book, and at what may be the most important understanding Atkinson has guided us toward. That will is not merely a tool, not merely a faculty, not merely something you develop like a muscle and then deploy in the service of various goals. Well, at its deepest level is you. The ultimate will and the true ego are bound together so closely that no analysis can fully separate them, which means that the development of will is, in the end, not separate from the development of the self. And so we close the first part of this remarkable journey through the nature of human will. What William Walker Atkinson has given us here is not merely a theory or philosophy. It is a map of the interior landscape, a careful, honest, illuminating guide to the forces that move within every one of us, every day, in every choice we make or fail to make, in every action we take or hold back from. He has shown us that will is not a single thing, but a living process, flowing always from the heat of desire, through the shaping wisdom of decision, and into the release of action. That desire will is a fire without which nothing moves. That decisive will is the intelligence without which fire becomes destruction. That action will is a release without which all inner preparation means nothing in the world. And he has shown us, finally, that beneath all of these phases lies something deeper still, the ultimate will, which is the ego itself, looking out at the world and saying quietly or powerfully, I do or I do not, and which cannot be fully explained by anyone, because it is too close to the center of what we are. If there is one message to carry away from everything you have heard today, it may be this. The development of will is the development of yourself, and you can begin right now in this moment by tending the fire of your highest desires, by practicing the discipline of genuine decision, and by trusting the spring of action that waits inside you, ready to be released whenever you truly, fully will it. What you have heard today is part one of this three-part work. Parts 2 and 3 are waiting for you on our channel, and in them, Atkinson moves from a nature will into its active development and practical exercise. The journey gets richer, deeper, and more practically powerful as it continues. Go to our channel now and listen to parts 2 and 3. Everything builds from here. And if this recording has spoken to something real in you, if Atkinson's words have stirred that quiet fire of recognition and desire, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel. Every subscriber helps us bring more of these timeless voices to more people who need to hear them. Subscribe now, share with someone who needs this, and keep going until we meet again in part 2. Thank you for listening,